All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome everyone, good day, and thank you so much for joining us. We're extremely excited to be here with you. My name is Kunal Laroya, your host for today. I'm the Executive Director for the Recruiters Network. For those of you that have not attended a webinar or recruiting conference in the past, I'd love to introduce you to the Recruiters Network and give you a brief overview of just who we are. So founded in 2011, the Recruiters Network is an organization committed to and focused on delivering professional development opportunities through peer-to-peer networking and educational conferences for leaders in talent acquisition and human resources profession. In addition to that, we're an organization that loves to give back to our communities through community outreach, charitable giving campaigns, drives, and much more. Currently, we have 16 regionally based communities, which you can see here highlighted in orange. For those of you who have previously attended one of our meetups, networking events, webinars, or recruiting conferences, you'll see that we've been rapidly expanding the past 18 months. And if you're interested in bringing a recruiting network event to your city, hosting and or sponsoring, you can reach out to myself, Kunal Laroya, or any one of our board members on the Recruiters Network webpage. Speaking of events, we do have several upcoming conferences planned for this spring in April and May, and have launched registration. So to find out more about any of our upcoming events, simply go ahead and visit us online at www.recruiters.network. All right, so some quick housekeeping items for today. First of all the slides and recordings will be available after the session for review. And secondly, the topics that we've been talking about today have been very popular amongst the audience. And we've already received several significant amount of questions for our panelists via email. And if any of you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A section on the webinar panel below. And last but not least, let's go ahead and get social and share the knowledge that you're learning today and help recruiting and HR professionals who couldn't join learn from your key takeaways. The hashtag on all social channels is hashtag RECNET. All right, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our webinar sponsors for today, Glassdoor. You likely know Glassdoor is one of the world's largest job and recruiting sites, which was built on the foundation of increasing workplace transparency. Glassdoor offers millions of the latest job listings combined with a growing database of company reviews, CEO approval ratings, salary reports, and interview reviews. So thank you, Glassdoor. All right, and last but not least, to our esteemed speakers, thank you for being here with us today, opening up and sharing your recruiting insights and tips from the C-suite. So without further ado, to introduce our speakers, I would like to turn it over to our moderators for today, Tiffany Kuehl and Jason Buss. Tiffany, Jason, welcome, and thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you everyone who is on today's webinar for joining us. And again, thank you to Glassdoor. As Kunal mentioned, my name is Tiffany Kuehl, and I am currently a member of the Recruiters Network Advisory Board. Previously worked as an advisory board member for Minnesota Recruiters, one of the communities that Kunal referred to earlier. And during the day, I work as the director for HR search at Verseek Search and Consulting based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in my spare time, I also volunteer with the Minnesota Society for Human Resource Management, serving on the State Council Board. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason for his introduction and then over to the speakers.
Great, thanks Tiffany, and thanks Kunal. My name is Jason Buss. I lead recruiting for MongoDB. Been in recruiting for 20 plus years. I'm just gonna say plus for the rest of my career. And also founded the Recruiters Network 9 years ago. Super excited to be here today. And in my spare time, unlike Tiffany, I don't volunteer for SHRM. I eat lots of frozen yogurt. So with that, I am going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, and again, want to thank each of you for taking time out of your day and your busy schedule to join the Recruiters Network and really provide educational and awareness opportunities for recruiting professionals nationally. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe Dennis.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, everyone. My name's Jo. I'm British, not Australian, which is a common misunderstanding, having been in California now for 13 years. But I'm, like Jason, 20 years in HR, and I'm the CHRO at Pinterest, based here in San Francisco. And I'm either a recruiter's dream or a nightmare, because over the course of my career, I've been a recruiter. I've led international recruiting teams all the way up to 500 people and all the way back to building them from scratch. So I like to think that that's helpful to the recruiting team, but it might get in their way from time to time, as I like to challenge us to think about things differently. And outside of work, I'm a keen cyclist, gravel, road, all of those things.
Awesome. Thanks, Jo. Kristen.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Kristen Nordling, CHRO for Dessert Holdings. We are a North American-based premium dessert manufacturer. We're currently working as a PE-owned company. We have 4 dessert manufacturing companies rolling up to us, and so I support Canadian operations as well as the U.S. operations. And yes, our desserts are amazing. You probably have had some of them. And a shameless plug, actually, Buffalo Wild Wings is just introducing our cheesecake this week. So definitely would love for you all to try it. You would also find some of our desserts in various retailers, grocery stores, and other restaurants as well. But to stick with the theme, I have 20 plus years as well of HR and recruiting leadership background. Also started my career in recruiting, and so I have a very strong passion for recruiting, and I'm probably my team's worst nightmare at times as well. The past 6 years I've been in private equity, where recruiting has been one of our top focuses, and really building high-performing teams, not only for the business, but also for the HR functions as well. I've worked in multiple industries, ranging from healthcare, financial services, and construction. But one thing has been consistent, like I said, is the need for recruiting. And in my spare time, when the lakes aren't frozen, I'm out on the lake enjoying the pontoon. So a little bit about me.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. Michael.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. I'm Michael Kane. I am with the Sierra Institute. That does not mean that I'm out hugging trees. Anyone who knows me would laugh at that idea. I am a managing partner. The Sierra Institute is a peer-to-peer community of CHROs spanning multiple industries across the United States. And I'm also an independent consultant. But for the last 30 years, I don't lie about how long I've been around or try and fake it, because if you saw me, you'd know that I was faking it. So I've been doing this for 30 years in some ways, in consumer industries, starting in durables with Whirlpool, and then in consumer packaged goods, and then retail and restaurants. So. Last 20 years, I was leading HR teams in businesses like Victoria's Secret, Express, Justice, and then most recently PF Chang's. So right now I'm an independent consultant and also a managing partner of the Sierra Institute. In terms of my time with recruiting, it's part of the whole mix, and so I have a relatively equal approach to it, and given the way that I know we're going to structure the conversation, I'm very excited about how we're going to talk about it in the context of the total human resource strategy. So I'm very, very happy and feel fortunate to be part of this panel. Look forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. We're excited to have you as well. And last but not least, Marie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marie Such. I'm the head of people for Figma. And at Figma, our vision is to make design accessible to all. We're a cloud-based collaborative design and prototype platform, and we're really created for the entire product team in mind, right? Designers, developers, marketers, anybody who has some hand, which is, by the way, pretty much everyone, in creating some kind of product. And it means that multiple users can create, they can share, iterate, gather feedback on files all in one place, i.e. a URL, so no more software downloads, that kind of thing. And we are based, we're headquartered in San Francisco. We're about to open our London office. I started about 1.5 years ago here, and we have more than tripled in size since then, and are poised to double again this year, London office, and perhaps more, about 160 today. And so talent acquisition, as you might imagine, is on my mind all the time. We are, again, being in San Francisco, it is a reasonably small pool, and we're all looking for the same thing. So what do we do about that? So I'm excited to talk more with all of you and the rest of this wonderful panel.
Great, thanks. And again, thank you to each of you for joining today. We were able to assemble a panel with wide-ranging industries and experiences to really give recruiting professionals insights into various company sizes, and we will go ahead and get started. So the real goal or outcome of today's conversation is to get inside each of your heads to figure out what are the conversations having, within the C-suite, the exec teams and business leaders around talent acquisition. And would love to start around the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Joe, would love to start with you. So I know Pinterest's mission is very admirationable, and it's really designed to bring everyone inspiration to create a life they love, right? How much more grand could you get than that? And one of the things that really I took note to was how Pinterest is one of the first companies to publicly release hiring targets and really the goal of being accountable. And I know you recently just published, I think a month ago, the most recent version of that. So would love to hear from your perspective. Hey, everyone's talking about diversity. We've all read the same article, say some companies are moving the needle, some aren't. Would love to hear from you a highlight or a success that you're really proud of. And then maybe a tip for people that aren't seeing as much progress on this, or someone just getting started, any insights that you could share with the group.
Yeah, and the story of us holding ourselves publicly accountable was because an engineer basically said something has to change in the industry, and we believe that it needs to be companies holding themselves accountable and being held by each other and in the industry at large. So I think that's a theme I would give you is the power of inclusion and diversity has to come from within. It is not a HR initiative. It is not a recruiting initiative. We certainly put the wings underneath the aeroplane here, but this has to come from inside the soul of the company, from your leaders top down, as well as empowering your whole community to contribute. And we care about inclusion and diversity because of the mission that you just quoted, Jason. It's like we want to bring everyone a life that they love. So it's that's so ingrained in who we are that in some respects you would think that makes achieving hiring goals somewhat straightforward for us, but that certainly is not the case, because to Marie's point, we're all fighting for the same talent. You could argue that it might be a pipeline challenge, but frankly, for me, this is about accountability. It is about as much about what it feels like to work at Pinterest and the product that we're creating. So when we released our skin tone filters 12, 18 months ago, that was because we wanted people, when they're searching for hair and beauty, that they feel like they belong on our platform as much as everybody else. So to give you something really practical that I have loved since joining the team and understanding, we try and tackle the opportunity that we have to build more balanced teams from both kind of our hiring goals and really holding our hiring managers supported by our recruiters accountable for that, as well as thinking longer term about the relationships that we have with people in the community at large. So two things that the diversity and inclusion team within Pinterest launched probably 2 years ago at this point. One were bespoke dinners, and the other one was nurture strategies coming from those bespoke dinners. So bespoke dinners are when we bring our engineering leaders together with 20 people from the underrepresented community that probably aren't interested in joining Pinterest, but we would love to have a relationship with them and build bonds in the community where we're supporting each other, learning from each other. That then kind of like feeds into what we call a nurture strategy, where all of our engineering leaders are connected to people from that community on an ongoing mentoring, coaching, friendship basis, which may lead to referrals and suggestions on talent that you might want to consider for job opportunities, or might lead to somebody wanting to consider Pinterest as a place that they might enjoy working at. So these are very long-term in nature. They've been underway for engineering for a couple of years. We just launched this for the people team under my own sponsorship. they are not about satisfying your immediate hiring goals, but they are about building connections to the community that exist outside of our walls, understanding what gets in people's ways, how we can remove those boundaries, and then building very personal individual relationships that may lead to referrals or may one day lead to a conversation about joining Pinterest. So it's as much about accountability and it's as much about individual in the moment hiring goals as it is about investing in long-term strategies and long-term programs that really don't just satisfy your hiring goals, but also invest in the community that we should be investing more in.
Okay, perfect. So one of the things that you shared, Joe, was nuance in words, but you referenced inclusion and diversity, and I've been fascinated with Pinterest Story, and as I've learned more about that, but would love for you to share kind of why Pinterest refers. Many companies say D&I, but Pinterest refers to it as IND. So I'd love to hear some quick thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's as simple as, in order to build a more diverse company for the long term and not just to satisfy a short-term priority, you have to be a company where everyone feels that they belong. And that's where the inclusion comes from. So you have to start with your inclusivity, and your HR leaders should be really focused on driving inclusivity in everything that we're doing. And then you also have strategies to drive more balanced hiring, to create a more balanced team for your company. But you do that supported by inclusion, so that people feel that when they show up and they start working for your company, that they belong, they see others that look like them, they feel like they can progress their career in your company, and that the processes, the programs, the people practices are supportive of everybody, not just one part of our community.
Okay, great. Thank you. Tiffany, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Very informative, Joe. Thank you so much. Much like inclusion, diversity, equity is a challenge for us when we are recruiting, we do tend to face a lot of other issues when it comes to bringing talent into the organization. So for 2020 and of course beyond, what do you foresee, and I'll pose this to a couple of you, what do you foresee as the biggest recruiting issues that you and your organization are facing today, and what are you doing about it? And Kristen, we'll start with you. With your challenges and what you and your teams are doing about it.
Yeah, so our biggest challenge, the majority of our workforce is a production workforce. So it's lower paid, a lot of hours, pretty demanding. And there is a workforce shortage, and so that, labor shortage, but that's not our challenge area. Our challenge area is actually in the skilled production area. So the skilled production workers that we need have a lot of options, and that has been our biggest challenge in this role that I am in today and with this company. We've had to look at our benefits. We've had to change how we pay people. We are, one of the selling points, we're helping people see the opportunity. Because we are a PE-owned company, we're leaner, there's less layers. Individuals will have much more experience and exposure to opportunities, and so we're helping them see that this could be a career opportunity for them, not just a job. So really selling the opportunity, we're changing the way we're recruiting and how we're getting talent, and helping them see that they could have a long-term career here too. The fact that we have 3 other plant locations, and we've got a corporate function, or the ops admin function is what we call them. They could take that path. So how can we help them with that, or leadership opportunities? So helping them see the bigger picture.
And Kristen, when you talk about the manner in which your employees are being paid, you're changing the pay. Say more about that.
Yeah, we're looking at, because a lot of our plants have to work overtime or work extended hours, so we're looking at different ways of incenting employees to pay. So not only the overtime, but we're looking at different reward programs. We're increasing our rates because our benefits aren't super competitive, unfortunately. Again, one of the challenges of working for a PE company where we brought in a bunch of acquisitions, we have to get creative on how we're incenting people. And so one of the ways that we have had to do that, we've increased hourly rates to help kind of offset the benefits as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kristen. And then Marie, you also mentioned something very similar in the introduction as far as talent shortage and being able to find the right people. In addition to that, what would you say, unless that is the biggest issue, but what's the biggest issue you're facing when it comes to talent acquisition, staffing, and recruiting?
Yeah, so two things kind of come to mind. I mean, I would say that's in addition to what Joe has mentioned around inclusion, diversity, because that has to be actually interwoven in pretty much everything you do. It's not an initiative that just sort of happens and kind of is on the side. We did a thing. So let's say that's number one, but I'll speak to two others that I've been thinking about. And, I think that in a small but rapidly scaling organization, you face the question of your processes, right? And how they serve or how they have stopped serving you and how quickly that happens, right? To some degree, this happens in any function, right? You're constantly assessing whether how you get something done is still good enough, or when is it time to invest in overhauling the way you get something done. And there's probably a corresponding drop of productivity that is then followed by a leap forward. And so kind of a metaphor I like to use is, again, I'm thinking about how we're building out people processes here as well, but for talent acquisition, it's equally valid. What do we need to build out of kind of duct tape and popsicle sticks because it needs to last for sort of, a certain amount of time, but then we know we're going to need to replace it. And what do we need to build out of rebar and concrete because that solid foundation is going to get you to the next level. And so on the one hand, you definitely don't want to be overly bureaucratic or process heavy. But on the other hand, again, as we grow or as you open up new locations, it's super easy to assume that the kind of osmosis method of information sharing is going to keep working, and it stops working actually way sooner than you think. So, getting aligned on sort of consistency and how do you train around alignment, the earlier the better. The more you can sort of embed that in your DNA, even when your talent team, can fit around one table, sort of, one pizza will feed them, your future self is really going to thank you. And then sort of somewhat related to the idea of, talent shortage and pools, get clear on remote work, get clear on distributed work and whether and how you're going to incorporate that into your strategy. Because if you don't think about it, one by one, you're going to fall into a strategy of no strategy, right? And it's actually pretty painful to unwind. And working remotely for a company that is largely headquarters oriented is quite challenging. It's a whole new way of working for a lot of people. And so do you also have the infrastructure on the people side to support that kind of work? And so as your talent acquisition team is looking, well, maybe we can expand the pool by going distributed. How is that actually working together holistically? And so just kind of giving some forethought to all of that, because it's happening. I mean, I'm experiencing this too now. It's happening very, very quickly. And the more you can sort of take a quick time out to just sort of put some scaffolding in place, the better time you'll have of it.
Excellent. Love that. Lots of conversations with candidates and hiring leaders about telecommuting and working remote. So very, very good to know that we're not the only ones thinking about that. Same question for you, Joe, and that is about your biggest challenges in talent acquisition and recruiting.
Well, one of them's within my own team. So all the things that we say to leaders about having succession planning, having leadership bench, having foundations, having kind of scalability. Honestly, right now for the Pinterest team, I mean, Pinterest is 10 years old as a company, but really it's only 5 years old. And we've grown so quickly that we don't have the kind of the level of succession and leadership bench and foundational processes that I think we need in order to move quickly for the company, but not lose sight of the quality of the hiring that we're doing, the diversity of the teams that we're building. So I worry deeply about that. When I think about, I think Marie mentioned this, but we are in tech and in here in San Francisco, we are all fighting for the same talent. So you've got to find ways to set yourself apart and attract talent for things other than the financial reward. From a kind of another lens on diversity, there is something unusual that happens in the tech space, where all of a sudden managers start to think that the only good talent out there is coming from Google. And that's just such not the case. So really kind of broadening the hiring manager's perspective on where great talent comes from and how not to be biased in so many ways, including the company name that's on someone's resume, is a perennial challenge. And talking of Google, and I think all our companies probably face this with your own competitors, but there's always someone who's got more resources, a different story to tell. And we just have to kind of keep fighting the good fight of why come to Pinterest, what the opportunity here is, why it's different, and how we remain competitive on things other than snacks, compensation, and all the perks that we all read about in the newspaper all the time. And that for me is like, that's cultural. It's foundational, and it's part of your soul as a company that the recruiting team have to keep bringing to the front of the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. And with that, Jason, I'll turn it over to you for the next part of our conversation.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about recruiting as a concern. So the Conference Board is a producer of one of the largest CEO executive surveys globally, and probably comes to no surprise to anyone on today's webinar that recruiting is highlighted along with retention, but we're going to focus on the recruiting piece as the #1 concern internally that CEOs cite in the Conference Board survey. And this has been a similar theme and headline for the last decade. So Mike, I wanted to turn it over to you and kind of get your thoughts and perspective on what recruiting professionals can do to try to minimize that concern and deploy strategies and be effective in their role to make sure that the company has a successful outcome as possible.
Thanks for the question. It's very appropriate, and obviously the fact that it's been on the survey as many years in a row means it's not going away anytime soon. So in my experience, what the C-suite and the CEOs and boards are most concerned about is really fundamentally two things. Is the talent stacked against the most critical strategies in the business? And then secondly is it's a contingency issue. So what happens if so-and-so, fill in the blank, wins the lottery, gets hit by a bus, whatever in between? So what does that require? What do those two questions require from recruiting pros is fundamentally, first, you have to understand the business strategies at a substantive and operational level, not a financial level. This is not, this comment is not meant to say, go become P&L jockeys and learn the ratios and so forth, but really fundamentally understand what are the strategies required from the business operationally, and what levers is the company seeking to pull, and how does that translate to what the talent is going to be required within the operation to actually win the game. And so that's the first conversation that you have to be plugged into, for lack of a better, more eloquent and strategic phrase. And then secondly, how, as a recruiting pro, are you integrating with your line HR team in terms of their succession planning conversation to understand where is the organization already strong enough and actually advancing the cause so that you are good and you're getting better, and or where are you not really winning the game, and or you're just too far behind, and therefore you need to be out in the marketplace creating relationships with potential backups. It's really not more complex in my view than that. And so where you have that partnership between your recruiting team and your HR business partners, and you're having those kinds of dialogues, I find that you're helping your executives sleep a little bit easier at night, because you're saying, we get it, we understand where the translation of the strategy to the operation, how that connection needs to be made, and we know where we feel good about the talent that's in-house, and we're out talking to the people where we don't feel good about it.
Okay, great, thanks. Joe, going to turn over to you. I know you'll be dropping shortly, but love your perspective on this, what recruiting professionals can do to try to help overcome such a big concern.
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of things. First, I think don't be shy about sharing the progress. So one, have clear goals, and then share clear progress against those goals. So I think data and sharing your pace with your leadership team is absolutely critical. Second, layer that with demonstration of how you're being creative about how you're bringing the best talent to your company and how you're confident in doing that. And then kind of inside your team and then with your relationship with your hiring managers, I think the CEO that I get to work with is looking for me to make sure that my team is able to deliver on the business need, because if we can't bring the talent to Pinterest, they can't deliver on their business goals. It's as simple as that. So they're looking for me and my recruiting team to be super clear about how they do that, whether we're making progress, and then have the flexibility within our resourcing to move up and down based on how the business is changing, and be really clear about who's got the accountability. It's too easy when things go a little bit awry or the business isn't delivering on its priorities for the kind of the needle to come back to the recruiting team if you haven't been clear about the role your team play, the role hiring managers need to play, and how you work together to get the best outcome, but ultimately who's got the accountability in hiring decisions and on being on pace. I think that like we got to own it, but equally accountability often sits within the business, and we need to make sure that they're set up for success and really clear about that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. Kristen, would love your perspective on this as a concern and what you and your team have been focusing on to try to overcome it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree 100% with Joe, so I won't add or repeat hers, but one of the things that I consistently hear from my leaders is they are expecting us to be the subject matter experts in the markets that we're in. So ensuring that, you know, we're staying ahead of the curve. We know what's happening. We know what the competitors are doing. We're, in some cases, breaking news for the leadership team to help them understand what's happening. And so some of the best recruiters that I've worked with have a pulse on that. And so I am, you know, one of the things I'm doing with my team now is training them on, okay, you guys are in these small markets. You should know what's been going on. You should know if there's new plants coming, and you should be, or if they're closing, you know, what can we do to get on top of that? So that's, that is somewhat of a big focus area for us right now, is just showing that subject matter expertise. The other thing is, you know, we find a lot that, especially recruiters that hold multiple requisitions, you know, it's tough to prioritize. It's tough to manage all those requisitions, and so a lot of times managers feel like they need to follow up and they need to take that lead. And so one of the things that I feel that differentiates, you know, the really solid recruiters that show leaders that they know what's going on is they're staying connected and they're checking in. They're helping leaders understand what's going on, so it's just not a black hole. And you know, that makes a big difference. And then one other area that I think can be a very big differentiator as well, and can help, is the recruiters checking in with their new hires. You know, a lot of times the new hires, you know, they feel like they're lost. They you know, those 90 days, sometimes you know, that first week is really, it's that honeymoon period, maybe the first few weeks, but then it turns into this is reality. And a lot of times the recruiters are good point people, and so being, you know, making sure that we're keeping those new hires engaged so that they're not leaving and that we're having to replace them. So that's one of the, you know, things that I am trying to help our recruiters see, that is a big value to the business, because that churn, that losing people within the first 30 days is a real thing, and that makes work and cost the business a lot of money. So what can we do to help in that area too?
Great. Tiffany, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Kristen. This is one of my favorite things, of the questions that we are kind of probing into today, simply because I've been in the middle of debates and going back and forth between executives, business presidents, and then recruiters who are on the front lines. Too often there's a disparity between what the two parties believe is going on within recruiting and talent acquisition. And that is with regard to the partnership between executives and recruiters. Now, what one or two things, in your opinion, in your experience as executives, as leaders in HR, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the executives in the organization, what one or two things do you believe recruiters could do to be more effective when they're partnering with executives and hiring leaders? And Marie, we'll start this one with you.
Great.
So I think this is in some ways a big plus one to what Kristen just said, and it's around communication and proactivity of communication. I mean, so many people in talent acquisition things can go back to communication, right? How do you figure out how to get the information that you need to be successful and also to showcase the progress that is being made, something that Joe said earlier. And that doesn't mean necessarily just having one template and one playbook and this is how I communicate and it doesn't really matter who I'm talking to on the other side. You know, really savvy people who are going to be successful, frankly, in whatever career they have, understand that figuring out how to communicate with whoever it is they're across the table from and how that person is going to actually absorb information, it's key. So being able to sort of tease out, it's not the golden rule. It's not like you're communicating in the way you would want to be communicated with. It's you're figuring out how they want to be communicated with and really working together to adapt that. So I'd say that's just tactically speaking, really figure out, you know, how often are you checking in? Is once a week enough? You know, is it actually a little bit, you know, every other day while a rec is really, you know, sort of hot and you're working on it? So I think that's one big thing. And then the other thing, again, amplifying something that that Michael said earlier too, is that talent folks really need to think about their roles as HR, right? That means understanding the product, understanding the business for real. You're not just reading a bunch of quotes off a page trying to sort of sell the EVP, right? If you go deep with the business units that you recruit for, you're going to be so much more effective at partnering. And again, I always like to think about the talent acquisition team. It's a partnership org, not a service org, not like find me the thing, you know, I'll see you when we're ready to sign. And this is especially true in smaller organizations, you know, like Figma, where there perhaps isn't a robust HRBP program yet. You know, here's an example, right? You know, Danielle is leaving her job on a team. You know, thank you, Danielle, for your service. Is this an opportunity to just get a clone of Danielle, or should we actually look at skill gaps across the team and figure out how we're now going to actually leap the business forward potentially? You know, can we close the skill gap? Can we diversify perspectives in some way? That, if a talent acquisition professional can be having those conversations with teams, the entire business really, I mean, it wins.
Love that. Thank you. Appreciate that. Kristen, from your perspective.
Yeah, and you know, I talked about it a little bit in the last question, and Marie also touched on it. But I think you know, communication is key. Setting those expectations up front. You know, again, some of the best recruiters that I've worked with have scheduled ahead of time. You know, those meeting or those status check-ins. But you know, the other point that I want to touch on is that understanding the business, understanding the product, whatever the industry, you know, whether it be the industry, the product, the business, and whatever you're doing from a recruiting perspective, making sure that you really understand it. Recruiting is sales, and so when you're out there talking to candidates, you need to know what the product or what the opportunity is, and being able to highlight that. So I think that is where the value is with hiring leaders and executives and recruiters. And when they see that, hey, I've got a good recruiter. This person really understands the role, is presenting the top few candidates to me, and really definitely understands what I need and what's going on in the marketplace.
Excellent. Very good points. And then Michael, from your perspective and in your experience, what have you seen work when it comes to recruiters being able to effectively partner with you and your peers?
I think Marie and Kristen have done a really good job saying two things. I would just add two things to the really good points that they both made. To the point about understanding the organizations that they serve, I think that every organization has one, maybe two pivotal roles within it. And those are the roles where you really have to find talent, because the difference between average and above average has disproportionate value to whatever that organization is trying to do. So as a talent hunter, which is what talent acquisition people are, you got to understand where those pivotal roles are. So I would simply, in addition to everything they've said, that's really your goal, finding those pivotal roles and then being out there in search of them. And then the only other thing that hasn't been touched on yet is, who do your leaders think are the most admirable and the, you know, competitors that you want to be in the know of, and who's in those organizations? That'll make you more valuable to your executive clients. And if it's completely obvious and that doesn't require much work on your part, fantastic. But if it isn't, figure it out. And or who are the people that maybe are executives. Some executives I've worked with, I'll be straight up, they're kind of lazy about it. So, you become really valuable when you start telling them, hey, maybe you shouldn't meet talent from this organization because I think this organization is somebody we should be paying attention to. So I would just add those two thoughts. But I think Kristen and Marie have done a really nice job so far on this.
Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that insight. So communication, understanding your market, understanding who your competitors are, very, very insightful. Thank you so much. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you to the next segment of the conversation.
Great. So we want to focus, this has been brought up a few times already today, but how competitive the market is. And, for anyone who's read the headlines, we see that, unemployment is at a 50-year low. Some people say there's more jobs than there are people. The reality is we're all competing for the same talent. So Maria, I want to just focus with you on this question specifically. Figma is a high growth organization and market's obviously competitive. So what are you specifically doing, or what is the company trying to do to compete for the best talent, given, in the Bay Area specifically, some of the challenges that our companies are facing?
Totally. So I'll say a couple of things. I think the first really is, what is your kernel of truth? What do you truly believe is special about working for your company? And, by the way, you should be doing this, of course, before you're talking to someone who, say, has a counteroffer or competing, right? But the more consistent that kernel is across various different people a candidate talks to throughout their journey with you, the better. And by the way, the more true it is, of course, the population you have, you're creating opportunities for them, and they aren't actually going to answer the emails that are being sent to them, many, many per week, trying to poach them out of the job they're in. So, if you think about competing offers or ways to close people, you're always going to have them, right? It is, but you can win over competing offers of ridiculously higher comp if the kernel that you're talking about and if it's consistent about is both true and speaks to that individual. And to be honest, if that kernel is sort of a meh for the individual, you'll probably regret going, and blowing up your comp guidelines to close that person, because it's probably not going to work out in the long term. So I think, getting clear on the kernel, and then I think that leads into my second point also, especially, early or high growth, is just having a thoughtful comp strategy. It's a key people practice, and the earlier you can work on it, the less you sort of, debt, if you will, you incur along the way. Get your comp philosophy articulated. I'm not saying it's going to stay true for, years and years and years the exact same way, but do that work to actually think about, what is your North Star in terms of, where you're in the market and how you're doing it? Because, the issues of equity, and I don't mean equity as in options, I mean literally sort of equal pay and the way you're doing things, that will sneak up on you, again, if you're sort of doing it one by one. And so if you're thinking about being competitive in the market, you really have to figure out how you're going to do that in a fair way. And so you don't just end up with a whole lot of exceptions, because that's not the way you're going to build a healthy organization.
Okay, great. I'm just out of curiosity, you mentioned kind of the kernel. How does Figma specifically align anyone who's interviewing and representing the company? How do you make sure there's consistency across interviewers? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, it's a hard question, especially again when you have people who are interviewing and they haven't necessarily been at the company for all that long. So, people aren't born knowing how to interview, right? And in high growth orgs, they're spending a ton of their time. So I think that the answer to that question is that you have to actually constantly revisit the questions and the modalities that you're using to interview. So hiring managers and talent acquisition have to be very tightly aligned around, are these questions, are we having abnormally high pass or fail rates? And to the degree we can tell, are there certain demographics that are, having either abnormally high pass or fail rates? Because that is all in sort of the consistency idea of, are we inadvertently not looking for someone's strength in an interview, and are our processes getting in our way? And so, when we think about, interview training becomes sort of a bit of a dirty word. And again, kind of the idea that we did a thing, we did a D&I training, whatever. So I prefer to think about it as a lightweight and easily repeatable way to educate interviewers on their rights and responsibilities as an extension of the talent team. Right? And we're not perfect at it, but the way we've approached it is we have a sort of core group of folks who are kind of trained up and ready to deliver a compact but information-rich presentation on why interview, right? And the premise of that is interviewing is imperfect, but it's not useless. And so we keep the groups very small to create a psychologically safe environment so people can ask, dumb questions about interviewing. So I'd rather have you ask them and have us unpack it together than you kind of go into this with a sort of tight smile and you just talk the whole time because you don't actually know how to do it. So we unpack why it's imperfect and sort of issues of bias, but then we also give people a holistic understanding of different types of interviews and how to consider competencies. One other thing I'll just say is you have to also think about the debrief process. Again, if we're you can do all you want in terms of training people to go in the interview, but then if you get to the debrief and you haven't talked about how you're not going to get sucked into Jason just doesn't feel like a culture fit. How are you actually defining culture? How are you defining values? What are you saying about them? And then what questions are you asking? What does success sound like? So again, thinking about that ahead of time, prepping it, practicing it, and then, sort of trying micro tweaks to what's happening, being self-reflective and self-aware as you go. And the work is never done. This isn't a set it and forget it type of thing. We're constantly reevaluating this as we grow and as we figure out, again, who are going to be the extensions of the talent team here.
Okay, great. That makes so much sense. And I think as people think about interviewers, many companies don't focus on, interview training as you referenced to it. And I've seen different studies that show somewhere between 70 and 80% of people have actually never been trained on how to interview, what questions to ask, how to set up the interview team, for success, how to calibrate, et cetera. So those are all really, really valid points. So thank you. Tiffany, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. So next we want to chat just a little bit about the leveraging of internal recruiters. So we're talking about succession planning. We're not just talking about the talent pool externally, but who do we have internally that has capabilities to move in and out of different roles, different functions. So I'm interested to hear about insights from you regarding how you're using your internal, or how you have used your internal recruiters to help support the succession plan. So how are you using your internal talent acquisition team to support the efforts that you have built out in your organization's succession plan? And Michael, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, in the large distributed workforce like I had in my last several roles, we used a pretty integrated process involving a partnership between our field recruiters and our field business partners. And so what that culminated in was a monthly talent planning process that where we would have the field recruiters who were focused on known openings, and then we would use the business partners to drive an anticipated opening process that was fundamentally built around two things: people who were going to get promoted or people who were going to fail. And so you marry those two together, you challenge them to be in active dialogue, and then you bounce that up against the line leaders at a regional level, and then you bring them together to have an active dialogue once a month that I would, or my field director would oversee, and then we would create accountability that way. And once you got that cooking, and then you would follow up, you got a very virtuous cycle of activity and accountability. And so you create, like I said, a very virtuous cycle of outcomes and follow through, and you really find that you start to move on things. Now, that worked for a large distributed workforce business that I was a part of, and it was actually highly necessary. And so that was my insight and my experience, and I can't think of trying to do it any other way in a similarly sized and constructed business.
Excellent, thank you. And I know, Kristen, you probably hadn't prepared for this question, but wondering if you, in your experience, have had your internal recruiting team also support efforts to redistribute talent throughout the organization as part of succession planning.
Yes, and not so much here at my current my current role, but in past roles, yes, they were very much a part of that, and they, that's part of the where I think of a successful recruiter. They're very keyed into who the talent is in the organization. And when they know who the talent is, whether it's because they brought them in or they've been meeting with them, but they're seeing themselves as more than just staffing professionals. They're seeing themselves as talent recruiters. That's internal or external. They're having those conversations. They're networking with the internal resources. That's where I've seen it be most successful. And that's, again, where recruiters can differentiate themselves is, really on viewing themselves as talent leaders or talent recruiters versus just external recruiters.
Excellent. I love that perspective. Thank you. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you for the next part of the conversation.
So Marie, Tiffany, I'm actually going to turn it back to you. Inadvertently, Marie and I were talking about the interview training, and I had a question planned, but she actually answered it, and it was just really around how you bring interviewers together to really try to make sure that they're as effective as possible. So just quickly, Marie, I don't know if there's any added context. One follow-up question I do have is, just given that you are working in a high growth organization, obviously it's a lot of times it's all hands on deck. Knowing you have new interviewers or people that are going to start interviewing, joining literally monthly, is that something that you do on a regular cadence, or how do you manage making sure that interviewers are equipped and trained at Figma?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we're literally thinking about, how do we operationalize this in a way that, we really feel like is happening consistently. So, and when we started it, I built the deck, I was delivering it, which I found very interesting and valuable to sort of have those conversations, because of course that deck does include also sort of the HR no-no questions, if you will, but not in a way that is just sort of meant to be punitive or turn people into robots. I think it's really important to sort of dig into the why, and give people insight into how inadvertently some of the questions that they sort of initially had viewed as just benign or kind of ice-breaky actually could create a situation where they themselves would no longer be thinking about what is the job to be done, but instead kind of be off in details that, frankly, in the worst case scenario could be a liability. And even in the sort of neutral or best case scenario, just don't have to do with the work at hand. So, now we're working on a system. How are we tracking that everybody has actually, been able to take that education, and, what ways, how are they experiencing the interviews? What's hard about it? When they're coming out of it, kind of even debriefing with the interviewers themselves. And I'll just give sort of one example also of something we're trying out in debriefs, which I mentioned before. One of our teams is working on when they're inputting feedback, which is a really critical part of, making sure you do that quickly and you try and not mix candidates up, but they're using they, them pronouns throughout the feedback as an experiment to see if, that can, as you're reading it, you don't have inadvertent bias kind of creeping in. And so sort of experimenting, like, and doing those micro tweaks, seeing how it goes, that's an interesting way to also make sure that, people are having a dialogue around what it is that we're actually trying to achieve here. And we're trying to, again, see people's strengths and as much as possible, really not get influenced by other factors.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. We talked a little bit earlier about that connection between recruiters and the executives, and it was mentioned, really being able to understand the business. And I think one of the things that we've seen over probably the last 7 to 10 years is an increase in the use of data. So a lot of HR professionals, lots of talent acquisition professionals are putting together dashboards, scorecards to help us kind of understand the state of the talent within the organization, and then moving to BI and data and analytics to help make better business decisions. One of the things I'm curious about is not just if that is working, but what are the most critical of those data points when it comes to HR recruiters interacting with the executives, interacting with you as the CHRO. So if we were to say these 1 or 2 data points are the key points that we're going to use as we're talking about how recruiting and talent acquisition is impacting the organization, what would those be? And Michael, I'll present that question to you.
I was thinking about this a little bit, and I tend to be really simplistic, so prepare to be underwhelmed. I look at open seat time and vacancy rate, because that's lost productivity. And so the organization assumes some vacancy rate in its planning, but are we losing productivity at a level above what we anticipated or not? So that's very simple. But then the other one that I look at is first year turnover. And first year turnover is purely on the company, right? Because we either selected poorly, we sold the candidates a bill of goods, or we onboarded poorly. And we own first year turnover as a company entirely. So it's really the second one that I get pretty maniacal about. And I put it totally on the company. And that includes the TA recruiting space, and it includes the generalist space. And it also includes the hiring managers, right? So it's a broad swath. So those are the two metrics I pay a lot of attention to. And I'm most maniacal whenever I've gone to a company. It's one of the first questions I ask, and it's one of the first metrics that I've always driven down. And it's amazing. It's been an amazing recurrence in my career of how high it's been and how quickly we can get it down.
Then how are you using that information to your advantage, or how? So if you're talking with your recruiting leader, you're talking with the recruiter that you're partnered with, how are you then taking that information and then using it? You said, you identified the two things that are important to you, but what does that mean to you, and how are you translating it for your business?
Sure. So when you walk in, and almost every situation I've walked into, turnover has been one of the first year metrics that I've been asked to impact. And so one of my first questions is always, what's your first year turnover? And the company's either not tracking it, or they're tracking it and doing nothing about it because the other senior executives don't even ask about it. And so when they're not tracking it, of course, what's happening, it's going nowhere good. So you can totally control it if you think about it and you put out a goal out there. If you asked all three of us that are on the call, I would imagine a reasonable expectation is to have your first turnover be in the single digits. If you've done your job recruiting people effectively, there's no reason why you should have anything that's 1 out of every 10 people say within the first year, yeah, I made a bad call here. The company shouldn't say it, and you should, and the candidate shouldn't say it. So every other time I've shown up, it's been well in excess of that 10% figure. If you think about a hiring environment and you say, I'm going to get that down below 10%, the impact to your total turnover becomes fairly significant. And all of a sudden, you've taken a big step toward dramatically decreasing one of the key metrics that I was being held accountable to. And it's so in your control in a way that you don't have to go out and think of really big other corporate programs and solve really big boulder issues. You can start dealing with something that you have. It's classic Covey, right? Circle of concern, circle of influence. You deal with your circle of influence thing and you go after it. And it's amazing. It also creates a lot of platforms for conversations with your recruiters. It says, how many times did we really try and strong arm a candidate into a hiring manager? How many times did we also let a hiring manager make a bad choice, and we didn't maybe run it up a flagpole? How many times did my predecessor also let a lot of hiring managers roll over really good advice from his or her team? So a lot of this falls on how I do my job. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why bad hires get made. And also, how many times did we just not put enough rigor into the onboarding process? We just, for lack of a better term, we half-assed the thing, right? So there's so many different things that we can do that just are otherwise create healthier environments for onboarding and creating good work environments, that when you focus on that one metric, they sometimes talk to recruiters, but they also make recruiters, I find, they feel much better supported in the environments where I've come into. And I've said, we're going to talk about this, we're going to focus on this. And recruiters have consistently given me feedback that they feel better supported about their ability to bring talent in and feel like it's going to get, it's going to get traction. And they feel like, oh, you're actually going to do 90-day check-ins with people. I forget who talked about it earlier in the call. These are just good hygiene things to do. And when you start talking about first year turnover and put a target on it, all of a sudden good things happen. And I've found that recruiters start to feel like, yeah, okay, I'm working for somebody and a group that's now more serious about making me successful.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. And with that, Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, we are actually out of time, but Kristen, I did want to get your perspective. So Michael just shared a lot of insights and knowledge around first year attrition and turnover. And in many companies that can be focused on quality of hire. Just out of curiosity, if you could quickly share your thoughts on what role a recruiter plays from a quality of hire perspective, and then we'll wrap.
It's the most critical role. I mean, it really is. I mean, taking that time and making sure that you're asking the questions of the candidates to make sure that you're really listening to what the candidate's saying, and you're asking the questions that you know are the most important to the employer and to the company. It's critical, and we are constantly looking at our recruiting metrics, and on a weekly basis we do KPI reports, and we are looking at how many people did we hire this week, how many people did we lose this week, where is our gap. And so ensuring that we're getting the right people in at all levels is extremely important, and I believe that the recruiting role is the most critical in that process.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks again to our panelists, and thank you to you, Tiffany. I'm going to turn it back over to Kunal.
All right. Thank you, everyone. All this talk about recruiting brings up so many memories. I had a really intelligent friend a couple of years back who was going through a series of interviews, call me up and frantically start telling me how they think they did horribly on these interviews. They didn't think they got the job, and even heard some feedback that the recruiters were making fun of them, and that they seemed very stiff during the interview, almost like a scarecrow. So long story short, they ended up getting the job. And out of curiosity, I asked, how is that possible? Didn't you think you did poorly on the interviews? And they replied, I don't know. I must have been outstanding in my field. So with that, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much. And to our speakers, Joe, Kristen, Michael, and Marie, for providing such valuable insights. This has truly been a delight. And thank you again to our esteemed sponsors, Glassdoor, for being such amazing partners. And most importantly, thank you to everyone that signed up to join us today. This would not be possible without you. So I'm incredibly happy we're able to have this conversation. I hope that you were able to have some actionable takeaways that you can share with your networks. As we wrap up, don't forget to check out our upcoming conferences this spring to a city near you, which you can find out more at www.recruiters.network. Until next time, I'm Kunal Arroyo, and we're the Recruiters Network. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.